Thanks, Selva. It's an important question, but I think I'll probably introduce myself a little bit so that people know me beyond Asar. Because, like Srivatsa said, I grew up in Bangalore as well, and I grew up at a time that Bangalore was very different. It didn't look like this. And while I didn't have access to a farm, I did grow up amongst the jacaranda trees, the tabibua trees, gulmohars, jackfruits, and so it was a time that I felt deeply connected with nature as well. And I think for me, and that's what drove me to be an environmental activist, because that's what I started off as. I think I still am, but I think my principles on that have changed a little bit. But while I was working in the space of environmentalism, I also realized that I didn't connect to the frameworks that environmental organizations in India were using. I thought they were extremely Western. They were very, very top-down, and they separated communities from the environment. So that's when I took a shift and I started working with the communities, specifically women in rural India, who are at the front lines of actually protecting this so-called nature that we romanticize and feel so deeply connected to. And as a woman in that space, I also embraced feminism, because I realized, and to be very specific, embraced intersectional feminism. And I'm saying that here because I think women is not a homogeneous group, and as women, different communities of women have different experiences based on their class, caste, geography, and that's something that was very, very crucial to my work. So today I find myself at a really important crossroad, which I think are two extremely important issues in India to tackle. Of course, the climate crisis, but also gender equality, and that's where I find myself. And through my work, because I'm also, through my research, my writing and practice, I'm also engaged in looking at post-growth futures and degrowth. So that's something that I also intertwine in my work quite a bit. To your question, I think that you'd probably get the most apt and impactful solutions if they were, if the power dynamic was sort of, turned on its head in some way. And because I believe, and the women that I have worked with, whether they are Dalit, they are Adivasi, or they are gender diverse persons coming from the queer community, they are generally people who are at the front line of this climate crisis. And one can't say that we're all experiencing the climate crisis, but I think there is a disproportionate burden that's been felt by certain communities, and especially women in those communities. And I would also say that while they are almost, we talk about them as victims and we talk about them, we position them in a certain way, it's really important to also flip that story in some way and really start looking at the leadership, the knowledge, the solutions that these communities intuitively have. We don't have to recreate anything, right? I think the solutions that are on ground are way superior than some of the solutions that our premier institutions in tier 1 cities come up with. And I want to give a small example of seed banks, right? It's something that now we look at in a big way in climate adaptation. Let's look at seed banks, what are communities doing around it. But for example, indigenous communities in India have been doing this for many, many years. Maintaining seed banks, conserving seeds of indigenous varieties, and the many varieties that even you were mentioning, much before climate change was something that was even part of our vocabulary, right? And I think what really is the need of the hour, and that's where I position my work, is how does one ensure that climate finance, which is now also a very big word in our space, how does that trickle down to actually some of these solutions? How do we facilitate and support some of these solutions and ensure that there is money for it? And I think that's the biggest challenge today, because climate change is a space that's been, I would say, there's a gatekeeping by technocrats, by people who are scientists, and it's believed that that's the space of climate, right? That's the climate crisis. But my work is flipping that around and saying that yes, that might be, and emissions is a big deal, but we need to look beyond emissions, and the real solutions and the crisis is actually happening at the grassroots and at the front lines, and that's where one must look at. So yes, you'd probably get the best solutions if that dynamic was completely shifted, and we've seen that. So yeah, and I gave you an example of seed banks, but yes. Yeah, no, that, I mean, though I'm talking about it, I just have to say that we facilitated it, and the work was actually done by the tribal community in Koraput, which is a district in southern Orissa. So, as part of, so women are kept out of a lot of decision making at many levels of governance, including Gram Panchayats. So, through the help of local CBOs, we basically, got women together, women who are anyway in leadership positions in the panchayat, as well as women who are not. Even though they are given positions of leadership, they don't have a say. And climate, you can forget about it. That's like it's a very masculine space. Like, it's controlled by the masculine in some sense. So the idea of the dream maps or the visioning map was the indigenous women, as part of intervening into the Gram Panchayat development process, created their dream maps of what would a climate resilient village look like. And while I'm using the words climate resilience, that's not the language they are using. I'm just using this language because that's the topic right now. But their understanding of climate resilience is, they may not use the language, but they understand it really, really well, right? They know what they need to do. So they created these beautifully drawn maps, and through those maps, they took those maps to their Gram Sabhas to basically influence the planning process. So prior to that, what the women had also done is that they had mapped the commons. So natural commons in there, which are like your forest, your water bodies, your grazing lands, anything which is for public, right? And it's not privately owned. So they mapped those, and they sort of looked at what was the decrease over 10 years because of climate. And they took that information to form the basis of these dream maps. So these dream maps were not just something that was done because they woke up one day, and it was backed by data that was collected by the indigenous women themselves. And the idea was, how do they get that through the Gram Panchayat development process to ensure that there's money coming into some of the things that they need. For example, protecting some of their livelihood assets, because they depend on the forest. So how do they protect those assets so that they can continue to continue their livelihood from that? So that was just an example of something that the women in Koraput are doing. Of course, people who pure play climate work in the climate science space may look at it as just this is just a grassroots level intervention. But I think one of the things that we've been really trying to do through this discourse is say that the innovation and creativity exists at this level, that you label as that it's cute and it's just some NGO run thing. And it's about, how do we get climate funders to shift their lens and look at that innovation and creativity. And also, it's a learning curve in some sense for climate funders, which we're hoping to facilitate, so that, as I said, it comes down to climate finance and how does that money trickle down to communities, especially women. Yeah. Yeah, so I'll just give you an example because that might make more sense than me just giving a theoretical thing to it. But as I said, one has to recognize the disproportionate burden of the crisis, but not necessarily victimize. And there's a really fine line of doing that. Those stories need to be told, but interestingly, those stories can't be told by people like us. They have to be told by them. And so there are some very interesting initiatives in the country trying to do that, but I'll talk about one that we know of and we're involved in. So there's a local, you can call them a media company, called Baimanus in Maharashtra, and they actually are training grassroots level journalists, right? So these are basically women and young girls from different districts of Maharashtra who are experiencing whether the crisis is about drought or it's heat waves or it's coastal flooding. They are training journalists from those areas to tell their stories in their way, right? And actually trying to get those stories pitched in mainstream Marathi newspapers and also some of the online English publications like Mongabay, The Wire, Pari, and all of those. So I think one most powerful way is passing the mic and making space for the women to tell their own stories. And I find that that's one of the most powerful ways to do that. It's also about training existing journalists, and storytellers and communicators as to how do you tell more feminist narratives which don't victimize women but actually also showcase their leadership in what they're doing, because many women are leading, whether it's models like 1 acre farming in Maharashtra, whether it's some of the work that waste pickers are doing in Karnataka, or it's indigenous women in Orissa. There are tons of examples in the country of climate action being led by women, but these women are not counted as climate champions, or that they are even part of the discourse. So I think that's one of the biggest problems. Like, we've been told that why should waste pickers be part of the discourse on energy transition? It's not about them, but it is about them. If they aren't there, your climate problem would be much more than it is today, because they are actually segregating your waste, they're ensuring it doesn't go into the landfill, and therefore reducing methane emissions. So I think there's a lot of discourse building that needs to be done, which is not being done, but it needs to be done. Yes. Yeah, no, you're right. And I think it's one has to look at it also. So when you talk about, one also has to see the social structures and the norms that women exist in. And that's part of the, I will just take maybe a few more minutes to explain that. I think so. The work, when we work on climate and we say gender in climate, so it's not like just putting the climate lens and completely forgetting that we live in a country there's no gender equality. So one has to address the norms and the society that women are living in. So if it's a woman farmer in Maharashtra or in Jharkhand, it's not as easy as saying, okay, you know the solutions, now tell your story. There's a lot of work that needs to be done with the women, which is also addressing their situation, the patriarchal system that we all are in. But I guess them probably a little bit more based on where they are located, their caste. So there's a lot of work to be done. So which is why that intersection, even though it's really popular, people want to work on gender and climate, but their solution would be, okay, let's tell a great story about a woman who's doing this amazing climate resilient farming, right? Or let's one has to do the work. We still have to address the many inequalities that exist in our society before we're able to pass the mic on. So that's a work that we do, which is why a lot of our work is not with NGOs who only understand agriculture or climate. It's also NGOs or organizations who understand gender. And I think finding that is, I believe, really important in this space. I think one of the big things that we're also talking about as people working at this intersection, like you spoke about your mother and you spoke about the drudgery of work, right, is not romanticizing this, because women also do care work and it's not recognized as work. So one of the things that we are talking about in the climate discourse is that care burden is going to increase, like, with climate disasters, and it's going to fall on the women. And it's going to much more fall on people in the working class, right? Working class women in some sense. So that's a huge thing that's missing from the climate discourse that we're also talking about. And I want to just give one more example. Like, one of the women are just left out, and how? I'm not only talking about the level where people are taking decisions, like something as simple as, again, because I work a lot in Maharashtra and we work on drought. So we are trying to figure out if there are early warning systems, right? Systems that can actually tell people there's going to be a drought, therefore start preparing. One is that those systems are just at a very, very top level in some sense. Then we engaged with the women farmers in Beed, which is a district in Dharashiv and Beed, and we realized that women don't even get information. So they are meant to do the labor, they are meant to do everything on the farm, but they have no idea. So if anything, the men are going to get the information, but the men are not the ones doing the labor. The entire preparation, like you spoke about is being done by the woman. So the idea is, how do you start intervening and saying that women are an important stakeholder, especially working class women? And that's our biggest challenge and biggest struggle at the moment in India and the climate change space that there is at the moment. So yeah.